shows, golf tournaments, big band concerts. But most of all, there have been memories, and tonight we will hear some of them. Join us now as Time Machine presents the 8th Air Force. Start engines plus 50 years. When the U.S. first entered World War II, competition for young recruits was fierce, each corps wanting to be known as the most elite or glamorous. Recruiting films featured stars like Jimmy Stewart.
If you're between the ages of 18 and 26, with a good bill of health, you can make as high as $245 a month. You see, the way the Air Forces feel about it, they're fighting and they're flying for the safety of our people at home, our mothers and fathers and our sisters and brothers. And to keep the terrible war of destruction that swept Poland and Belgium and Holland and blasted homes of good people in London and Coventry and maimed hundreds of innocent women and children in Nanking and Burma and Bataan Peninsula and Pearl Harbor. To keep that war from our own shores, our cities and our homes. The roar of 100,000 motors sing their song, and theirs is a song of freedom. Their wings outstretched in the cause of decency. And each spinning prop drones in vengeance against those who would destroy our way of life. But somebody's got to fly them. A lot of somebodies have got to fly them. Now this is your place. This is where you'll serve America best. Young men of America, your future's in the sky. Your wings are waiting.
No one today can begin to comprehend that recruiting film's emotional impact on an impressionable teenage boy. I was nearly 18 years old and was about to join the Navy where my father had served in the First World War. Well, when I walked out of that theater, it was goodbye anchors aweigh and hello wild blue yonder. Jimmy Stewart, by the way, was to later fly with the 8th, where he was the deputy group commander of the 453rd Bombardment Group in the 2nd Air Division.
In the spring of 1942, U.S. Air Force commanders went to England to organize an Anglo-American bomber offensive. The overall commander of the American Air Forces was General Carl Spaatz. General Ira Aker commanded the 8th Bomber Command, which was later redesignated as the 8th Air Force. Both Spaatz and Aker were disciples of General Billy Mitchell, one of the first American air power advocates. By mid-1943, Germany was still a formidable opponent. The Luftwaffe Fighter Command had an impressive array of pilots and aircraft. Their Me-109s and FW-190 day fighters represented the latest technology. Their early warning systems and ground control were unmatched. The quality and quantity of their anti-aircraft artillery, unprecedented. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, was easily the ablest member of Hitler's cabinet. Time and again, he was to save critical portions of Germany's industry through his dispersal tactics. The fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe were commanded by Adolf Galland, who came from their ranks. His tactical instincts were sound, and most historians agree he was a far better leader than his commander, Hermann Goering. Robert Burns remembers first hearing about a new flying formation the Allies would adopt.
And I walked into our headquarters building one afternoon, and here was a colonel whom I had seen and knew who he was, but I hadn't met him. It was Curtis LeMay. And he was arranging a set of model airplanes which we had, and he had them set out on this tabletop, and he announced to me that this is going to be the new 8th Air Force formation, which was a stacked series of a lead group, a high group, and a low group. And, of course, it didn't take a lot of elaboration to see the fundamental sense of this arrangement. And he had told me that his task was to go around all the groups, explain this setup to them, and pass on the word, this is what we're going to do. And if you recall, in those days, particularly within the military, there was just not a lot of argument that you gave to the powers that be when they said, this is what we're going to do. That's what you did. And particularly if it sounded reasonable to start with.
Initially, the combined Allied air forces suffered disappointing setbacks. In Washington, General Henry Arnold, a member of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, demanded to see some positive results. Arnold was under increasing pressure from the Navy, which wanted the 8th resources. General Spaatz summoned his group commanders to an emergency meeting.
And they said, oh, yes, General Spaatz been waiting for you, looking for you. He said, go right in that door there. I went in the door there, and there were Spaatz with his whole staff, O.A. Anderson, and all those guys sitting around talking about and laying out the missions to come in the next few months. But in any event, it was to be the big push to make to make the B-17 and the bomber force into something that would be helpful to Arnold in trying to keep the B-17s and the bombers in England and keep daylight bombing alive, because we had really not made a very good showing up to this point, even though we'd had some heavy losses. So there was a lot of pressure from General Arnold on the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command, and particularly on Acre, to do something. We've got to make a breakthrough. In the discussion, I can remember very clearly the horrendous losses that they knew were likely to come. Spaatz I guess he had approved the plan anyway, but either before or shortly, or as soon as he had approved it, he turned to me and he said, Lyle, will the guys go? I said, you better believe they will.
The plan was to fly a series of deep penetration missions. The first, on August 17, 1943, was the Regensburg Scheinfert raid. This brilliantly conceived plan called for the 3rd Air Division under its new commander Curtis LeMay to bomb an aircraft plant at Regensburg, then continue south over the Alps to North Africa. Within 10 minutes of the Regensburg strike, the 1st Air Division would bomb the ball-bearing plants at Scheinfert. This double strike would confuse the Luftwaffe and stretch its resources. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned. That day, there was a thick fog over the United Kingdom. LeMay, who was flying as mission commander with the 96th Group, had always been a stickler for training his pilots in instrument flying. He managed to get the 3rd Air Division into the air in spite of the fog. But the 1st Air Division was delayed. With customary candor, LeMay wrote in his post-war memoirs, "Now, we couldn't afford to horse around. With the flight to North Africa, fuel was critical. It was either send us or scrub the mission." The Air Command in Washington sent orders that the 3rd should go. 3.5 hours later, they also sent the 1st Air Division to Scheinfert. Both divisions were flying without the benefit of long-range fighter escorts, and by the time they reached their targets, the Luftwaffe was ready and waiting.
I was on that mission, and I can assure you that the lesson was brought home to me, and I think every other man that was in a bomber on that mission, that we needed help to fight our way through the German Air Force that was being thrown against us. That was the most horrendous day that I spent in the entire war, was the first Scheinfert show. We started being attacked about mid-channel on our way into Germany, and it was a continuous running fight all the way essentially to the target. And you could look out the window at any spare minute you had almost and see a B-17 spinning out of control, exploding in the air. I never saw anything like it.
Anyway, comes the Scheinfert mission, and I'm leading a composite group of 303rd, 379th, and 384th. You just went to the target by following the fires.
The Regensburg force lost 24 planes. At Scheinfert, the 1st Air Division lost another 36. Altogether, the Allies lost 600 crewmen. So for the time being, daylight bombing missions were put on hold. After the loss at Scheinfert, the confidence of the men of the 8th Air Force was badly shaken. When Time Machine returns, the danger escalates as the bombing missions over Germany intensify. Stay with us. Time Machine returns to the story of the 8th Air Force. After the Regensburg-Scheinfert mission, the men of the 8th Air Force were badly shaken, but not demoralized. Their spirits were lifted by wildly exaggerated estimates of the number of enemy fighters they had destroyed. The initial claim of 288 German fighters was pared down to 148, plus another 100 damaged or probables. Had even those numbers been true, it would have been a catastrophic blow to the Luftwaffe. Actually, the Germans had lost only 27 aircraft, a very manageable price to pay for the losses they inflicted. Believing the inflated numbers led the Allies to make some very dangerous assumptions. One was that the Luftwaffe was badly depleted. It also kept partially alive the hope that the bombers, although they had been badly mauled, might still prevail over German fighters. This hope was to be cruelly dashed in early October. Between October 4th and 13th, the 8th lost 88 bomber planes in 4 raids over Germany. On October 14th, they set out on another mission, now referred to as Black Thursday.
We went back to Scheinfert, and I can still remember going into the briefing room and having the briefing officer uncover the big map with that line across to Scheinfert. And Colonel Stevens was commanding officer at the time. And he gave us the usual pep talk at the end of the briefing, and he said, this target is so important that if every pilot in this room were to dive his airplane fully loaded with bombs into the target, we'd consider the mission a success.
To the best of my recollections, it's the only mission I was ever on where they read us messages from the world leaders before we ever took off. And the plan was there was supposed to be 300 bombers, I think 100 B-24s and 200 B-17s with fighter escort, and we were going to smash the German ball bearing industry.
From the time that the fighters left us until they picked us up again on the way out, we were under constant enemy attack. I didn't know the Germans had so many different types of aircraft. They had everything that they owned in the sky that day. We saw Stuka dive bombers. We saw 4-engine bombers that sat out beyond the range of our 50 calibers and lobbed shells into the formation. We saw all the fighters, of course, that they had. And this was the first time that I recall ever seeing rocket attacks. But I can still remember very vividly as we started to turn from the initial point onto our bomb run, 2 airplanes in the group just ahead of us just hit by rockets and completely disintegrated, just nothing left of them.
We had lost an engine in one of the attacks just before the target. By that time, everybody was terrified. I had never seen so many fighters, so many airplanes, and everybody hated us. They were doing everything from dropping bombs on us to firing rockets. I never saw so many enemy aircraft again. Anyway, we had lost 1 engine before the target, and just after the target, we lost a 2nd engine, and we couldn't stay with the group. In those days, that was a death sentence, because the minute you straggled, the Germans nailed you. Well, we looked around in sheer terror, and there were some other stragglers, and we managed to form up. 7 of us, as a matter of fact. The man who was leading, the pilot who was leading the group, everything forward of the cockpit was gone.
We flew back. We could have flown back just following the fires on the ground from crashed airplanes, both enemy and American.
All the officers, flying officers in my group, left could eat at one table. I was made a first pilot at that point. 4 of us were actually made first pilots. The next mission, I think I was more afraid of taking off and landing than I was the mission, because I had been on more missions than I had taken off and landed. The 4th mission after that, I was the only one left of the 4 co-pilots that had been made first pilots.
At day's end, another 60 bombers and their crews were lost. Along with the 88 already gone, the 8th now had lost 148 bombers. It took an average per mission loss of 4% for a crew to have a reasonable chance to finish 25 missions. A 10% loss ratio was considered unacceptable, and now losses were a catastrophic 20%. The survival chances of the crews were virtually non-existent.
The missions were set at 25 missions, and at that time, in my group, just one crew occasionally, or maybe even just one person, would make it through the 25.
Flying at that time in October of 43, we had to fly 25 combat missions, and if you finished your combat missions, you were flying on somebody else's time.
They took an awful beating, but they never failed to go. It was amazing to me. I'd catch fellows behind the airplane, sick as a dog and throwing up, and get back in that airplane and go on the mission.
The Luftwaffe knew they had won a stunning victory. The German pilots were euphoric. They thought they had beaten back the 8th for good. But what they could not have anticipated was the development of 2 Allied airplanes, which in the next 180 days would turn the air war around. In a moment, a development which would virtually turn the air war around. Utilization of the astonishing long-range P-51 aircraft. When Time Machine continues. Time Machine returns to the story of the 8th Air Force. This is the P-51 Mustang fighter. Fitted with long-range drop tanks, it could fly to Berlin and back and outfight anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. Finally, the Allied bombers had the protection they needed to get to and from their targets. And there were new bombers. The new B-24 Liberator. With an enormous bomb bay, the B-24 could carry twice the bomb load of a B-17. And with powerful Pratt & Whitney engines, it could fly farther and faster than the B-17.
The B-24 was an excellent airplane. The one thing I remember about the B-24 is you had to maintain speed. It flew, it flew very well at 165, and it'd fly at 160, but below 160, it got mushy, and you couldn't fly formation below 160. You have a difficult time flying the airplane, really. And one thing that we used to try to do with the newer airplanes, the ones that weren't war-weary, if you get the airplane on a step, a B-24 would fly, you could fly the whole mission mushing with the wings up, and you'd have to pull more power, and it's sloppy as hell flying. But if you could get it up on the step, we used to call it, where the tail was up high, it was easy to fly and easier to control.
The B-24's finest hour came in the summer of 43. 3 groups, the 44th, the 93rd, and the 389th, were sent to North Africa. They began training for what would be one of the most spectacular missions of the Second World War. The first raid to the Plosty oil fields in Romania was flown at treetop level.
First of all, the B-24 was chosen because of its range. There was no way that the 17 could fly that distance and carry that kind of a load. We were able to carry a very sizable bomb load, 6 1,000-pound bombs, and go do a 1,400-mile round trip. In fact, when we got back, I failed to mention it, we had a very adequate supply of gasoline. We could have gone another, 600 or 700 miles without any problem.
The mission was flown on August 1st. Over 1/3 of the attacking force was lost. 5 individual Medals of Honor were awarded, an all-time record.
We had to climb to 14,000 feet to get in over the mountains. Then we immediately dropped down again to avoid their radar, thinking we had avoided it. Right, we dropped down right on the ground, and we were to go to the first initial turning or initial point that we had designated for our navigating was a railroad. This lead bomb group turned on the first railroad, which was the wrong way to go, and they went off. We never did see whether they hit a target. We don't think that they hit any targets at all. So we decided I said, and I'm sitting in the nose as the bombardier and navigating too. And I said, well, why don't we just hit the target from the south? We were scheduled to hit it from the north. So we came in, and as we came in and we were on the ground again, these haystacks there would pop open and these guns would come up out of the haystacks. There were little shacks that would just fell flat and the guns came up. And we came in, and with those .450 calibers, I pointed right at one of these black towers and just sort of cut off the top of it. It was amazing how really powerful that those .450 caliber guns were. Now, we didn't get much fighter attack. We did lose, I think, about 12 planes over at the target. In all, we lost, in our group, out of 36 airplanes, we had 17 airplanes that were lost. Some of the groups lost more than that. We later discovered that after this mission that we had knocked out approximately 70% of the production of West. Probably the most successful mission, even though it was, our losses were extreme.
By General Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was a very aggressive commander who made the destruction of the Luftwaffe and its pilots a priority.
General Aker was sent to the Mediterranean. He made a series of trips around to the bases and to the air divisions. And I was at the meeting with him and the group commanders, and he said that their attempts to get the German Air Force to come up when we sent our fighters over there were absolutely fruitless, and that the only way we could get the Germans to come up and fight was to send the bombers. So that from there on forward, the job of the fighters was not to give direct support to the B-17s or the bombers, but that the bombers would be sent to flush out the fighters, and our fighters were supposed to take advantage of that situation and not attack the Germans until they had committed themselves or in a position to attack bombers. So what it boiled down to was that the bombers were being used as bait. And when the meeting was over, I walked straight up to him, and I said, I want to make sure I understand this, that the bombers are now the bait to attract the German fighters up. He said, that's exactly what I said.
Hermann Goering's way of dealing with the attacks of the long-range P-51s played right into Doolittle's plan. With his typical bravado, Goering assured Hitler that the daylight bomber offensive would be defeated, and that the Allies' use of fighter escorts was nothing to worry about. This led to his disastrous bombers-only order, which directed his pilots to attack the Allied bombers and ignore the fighters, leaving the German planes dangerously exposed. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the strategy would be fatal. The turning point of the air war, when Time Machine continues. Time Machine returns to the story of the 8th Air Force. One of the major turning points in the war came on March 6th, when the 8th came to Berlin with 670 bombers and 800 fighters. Germany's capital had no great strategic value, but its psychological value demanded a response, and the Luftwaffe rose to the bait. For the next few days, massive dogfights raged over the skies of Berlin. On the first day, the Germans shot down 69 Allied bombers, a record. As was always the case with heavy losses, certain units bore the brunt. The 100th Bomb Group, known as the Bloody 100th, lost half its force. By March 9th, the number of downed Allied bombers rose to 112. The veteran 96th, 95th, 91st, 92nd, and 388th suffered terribly, along with the newer 452nd, 458th, and 453rd. But this time around, the Germans also suffered. On March 6th, the 8th Fighter Command accounted for 81 confirmed German kills, while losing only 11. Thanks to the fighter escorts, the chances of an Allied bomber crew surviving a tour of missions were beginning to improve. "50 years later, the bomber airmen still feel very grateful to the fighter pilots for the protection they provided. Men like Zemke, Gabreski, Johnson, and Ilfrey are some of the unsung heroes of World War II. Time and again, they risked their lives on behalf of bomber crews. Without them, the Allied bomber offensive against Germany would most likely have failed.
My greatest consolation as a fighter pilot has been I'm a team member. In other words, I had a job. My job was to protect the bombers. It was to keep the bombers from being shot down so they can do the job that they were destined to do, destroy the military might of the German machine.
Another part of Doolittle's plan was to have fighters drop down and strafe what were called targets of opportunity. This could be very hazardous depending on what was hidden in those targets.
I strafed a very innocent-looking string of 3 boxcars sitting all by themselves on the siding. And this was one of my first few missions. I probably later on I wouldn't have wasted ammunition on this 3 boxcars with no locomotive around. But I got a hit on the middle one, and it blew up in a tremendous fiery explosion way up higher than I was, and I flew through the debris of that explosion, and it flattened the leading edges of my wings and the leading edges of my tail and knocked the spinner off of the propeller. And the airplane was so black from oily smoke that I could barely see out of it.
Like the fighter pilots, the photo reconnaissance pilots also flew missions over enemy territory. But unlike the fighter pilots, these Photo Joes, as they were called, flew in stripped-down, unarmed planes.
And we had many people that did over 50 missions, 50 and 60. I think one fellow had 65 missions. But at first it was Photo Joe, as they said, was a sitting duck, really, for the Germans. If they wanted to shoot Photo Joe down, all they had to do is track him in by radar, and he's going to come back out the same way and have that airplane positioned above him.
Our main and only purpose in life was to process the vast amounts of aerial film that was shot over the continent by our photo reconnaissance planes, which would take off every morning just immediately before dawn to get across the channel and over into the pertinent areas to begin shooting at the first instant of daylight. And they would suffer a lot of casualties, and a lot of guns were aimed at them during their tremendous job of photographing the combat areas.
The pilots knew that without that ground crew, they never have an opportunity to get that plane up in the air. And I can assure you that I think the hardest thing of all was when a plane went out, and first of all, if it aborted, that was a blow to the ground crew. But if it was lost, and the men waited for something to return that was never going to come back, they felt it very, very much also. There were several men within that fighter group that performed acts of heroism in getting the pilots, not necessarily their own pilot out of the plane, but If a crash on the field and they happened to be in a position, they never hesitated to go help him.
The cold was the worst thing. The fact that you could touch a piece of metal and your finger would stick to it. 40 degrees below zero, 60 degrees below zero. Sometimes I flew back in the waist. On a few missions I flew in the waist. It was unbelievable back there. With open waist windows a lot of the time. And that air just blowing through there. When I first got over there, you saw so many guys that had frostbite, and it was terrible. But the cold was the worst thing for me.
The long hours, and I think one of the worst things was the severe cold. And when I say cold, the cold that boys from South Texas had never heard of that kind of cold in their life. When you talk about 25, 35, 40 degrees below zero, and so that was real miserable for a person like myself, and I think all the crew members and all the men that flew.
More real-life stories from the heroes of the 8th Air Force when Time Machine continues. As the war came to a close, thousands of Allied airmen were held by Germany as prisoners of war. In fact, by early '45, there were some 43,000 Allied airmen behind the wire, and 28,000 of those were from the 8th. For all the men who were captured, the experience was frightening. The trauma began with trying to bail out of a stricken aircraft, usually out of control or on fire.
At any rate, I knew that we weren't going to be in the air long, so I rang the alarm bell and I held it till I figured everybody had bailed out. In those days, we were wearing chest chutes, so my chute was under my seat. So I held it until I figured that everybody was out, and I reached under and got my chute. And about that time, apparently we lost a wing because I started tumbling around in the airplane. And for a minute or two, I thought, well, you know, desperately you think, well, I'm going to find a window or something and I'm going to crawl out and everything. It's going to be wonderful. Then I realized that wasn't what was going to happen, that I was being killed, essentially. And it's kind of humorous. You always hear these stories about your life flashing in front of your eyes. I just remember thinking, the next thing I knew, I could see light and dark and light and dark, and there wasn't a sound in the world. And I looked out, and I still had my chute in my hand, and I pulled it in and hooked it on my harness, pulled the ripcord, it opened and hit the ground. So obviously I was out some time, I don't know.
We barely crossed the targets and had our bombs away when the guns was, you could see the big black smokes just exploding on each side of the plane. The pilot was trying to miss them. He'd go this way and that way. And finally one time as he crossed that path, one got us in number 3 engine right behind the firewall. And I could see gasoline coming out of there, out of a hole, looked like it was that big around, and that it was on fire, and the aluminum on the plane was just melting like water and running off. Probably a lot of it was gasoline. But they gave the order to bail out, and so as a crew, we scattered them all over there, I suppose, for 30 miles off the target. We left the plane. I remember thinking, boy, this, when I jumped out in that slipstream, it'd be quite a personal experience. But actually, it was almost like death quiet. Once you cleared the plane, you just fell free fall, and you couldn't tell whether you was going up or down. You just fell.
Out of our bomb group that day, of 22 airplanes going in, there was only 6 that got back. There was 15 or 16 of us shot down within a matter of 10 minutes. And it was, of course, the worst loss of the 392nd in the entire war, when we had lost control of the airplane and went into a spin at about 18,000 feet when we were hit. The last thing I can remember before we lost control was looking up over the right wing and seeing the face of the German fighter coming over the right wing, so close that I could actually see his face. And at that time, we lost control.
Escort pilots kept radioing to us to jump. They encouraged us very much to jump. But as a discussion among the crew, we decided that we didn't really want to jump. It was us that would have to sit out the war there, and we decided we wanted to go on and try and make it out to the North Sea. Well, we got probably within 5 miles of the coast and by this time, and we were down to 5,000 feet. The fourth engine started going out too, and we went into a spin. Well, there was just one thing to do. The pilot hit the bailout bell, and out everybody went.
Most of the men escaping their aircraft were either injured or in shock. By the time they landed, the Germans were waiting.
I could see the German Wehrmacht had a circle of men all the way around. His eyes drift across the field while they was going right along with me. And when I hit the ground, it just like to knock me out. I guess our chutes were rather small, those chest packs. And the Germans just closed in on me. And first one in Braille, broken English, asked me if I had any broken bones, and I told them no. So one got on one side of me and one on the other and held me by the arms and started off, and one of them let go, and he hit me in the chest about as hard as any man ever could hit me. Knocked me down, and I remember somebody kicked me in the ribs, told me to get up, and I didn't have any breath. I had a hard time getting up.
The villagers, it was a little village outside of Brunswick, were there, and the town Nazi came out, and he had his little pistol, and he was screaming and yelling and belting us here and there with his pistol, and finally I guess they decided they were going to hang us. So they went away to get the ropes, and about the time they got back with the ropes, why, the Luftwaffe showed up. I think they had the ropes around their neck, as a matter of fact. And the Luftwaffe showed up and claimed us as prisoners of war. But to pacify the villagers, we had to walk into the village in front of the car with these ropes around their neck. And I couldn't walk, so they went and got some poor Russian prisoner, which I always felt sorry about. And I leaned on him, and we walked in front of the car, and people threw rocks at us and hit us with umbrellas and things like that.
I found there was some bloody Mae Wests, that over-water Mae West thing we used to have to wear. The yellow ones had our names stenciled on them. Anyway, there was 4 of my crew members' vests in there, and they had little holes in them, and I asked him, I said, what's the matter? And there's also blood on them. I asked him, what are these here? He said, well, the German civilians had pitchforked 4 of my crew to death. And that was the pilot, co-pilot, my radio operator, and the ball gunner. And they said that that's what happens if the civilians got a hold of you.
When they unloaded us off the train at Frankfurt, the RAF was just leaving, and I saw the German civilians capturing English flyers, wiring their hands and back up and throwing them into burning buildings. So they did not like anybody. They finally spotted us, and the officer told us, he said, anybody that can walk or crawl, help somebody who can't, and get in this freight car. Well, there's a freight car quite close. So we got in the freight car, and he locked it. So then they decided to set fire to the freight car, and he ran down the track and got a little switch engine, pushed the car out of the station, and then they unloaded us. But it was getting pretty smoky in the car by the time we got out.
Being a person who suffers from claustrophobia, to be placed in a cell 4 foot wide and about 10 foot long, and a wooden bed and a wooden stool, your only companions, the walls start to close in on you. And I think we all possess a certain amount of fear, and the fear just permeates the whole body and affects the mind, because you're alone and the mysteries around you. What's going to happen, what has happened, what's happened to your crew members.
Colonel Delmar T. Spivey was the senior American officer at Stalag Luft 3.
Colonel Spivey was asked to present a list to the Germans of all the Jewish POWs in the camp, And Colonel Spivey said, "We have no Jews here in this camp. We are all just Americans."
Colonel Spivey's refusal to compile such a list on 2 occasions was probably a life-saving act. The Germans were left to get the information themselves.
He asked me my mother's maiden name, and I thought, well, what the hell, if you can make something out of that, go ahead. So I told him my mother's maiden name. I figured, you know, anything to duck getting critical about this. So then he started getting very critical about things, and I said, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. So we went through the routine. Finally, he pulled out his pistol, and he cocked it, and he pointed it at me. He said, "Are you sure there's nothing you can tell me?" And I remember thinking, which is humorous now, if I see his fingers start to tighten, I'm going to say, wait a minute, I just remembered.
Given the close sense of family within each combat crew, there can be no greater anguish than that of a sole survivor.
It's difficult how the unknown factors are the bothersome things, particularly right after you're shot down. You expect to see the rest of your crew, and they don't show up. Then along through the interrogation, why, one of the interrogators tells you that all the rest of your crew have perished. And you don't know the how, the why of it. The only thing you know is the where. And you really don't know how it happened. The explosions, the flak, the dead engines, the instructions to leave the aircraft. You assume that everybody else has gone out when you've gone out, and you end up alone. And you never forget. It's always with you. Wondering. You think of those youngsters in their 20s, and why weren't they given the break that I was given? What is the calling that it was that I should have survived and they shouldn't? Is it something I'm supposed to do in this lifetime? Or is it something that an heir of mine is supposed to do in this lifetime? What is the master plan? I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult.
The 8th Air Force flew its last mission of the war on April 20th, 1945. 16 days later, May 6th, Germany surrendered. Without the achievements of the 8th Air Force, the outcome of the war in Europe could have been quite different.
If you or a member of your family served in the 8th Air Force, please call the 8th Air Force Historical Society for information about reunions and other activities. The toll-free number is 1-800-833-1942. To order a video cassette of this program, call now, 1-800-423-1212.
That saved a wretch like me.
There's terriers and poodles, St. Bernards,
Retrievers, shepherds,
breeds galore.
And they'll be A&E Stars, Sunday on Dogs, an A&E special presentation.
Now, in the 80s, the Navy was making a lot of fatal mistakes.
But in the 90s, they became a super fleet.
We'll look at the reasons behind the turnaround on an all-new investigative reports next on A&E.
It's time well spent.
To fear and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace